So it's an overview of a range of issues which I think crop up in the phenomenology of agency and which are starting to be discussed but haven't been discussed much yet. So, some orienting questions. Here are three. What is the structure of the phenomenology of person agency? That is, what kind of contents are involved in being an agent, in the experience of being an agent, and how are those contents related? What is the content of, is the content of the phenomenology of agency veridical? That is, does it accurately represent the actual way agency is? So in the same way we can ask whether the contents of visual perception are normally veridical, we can ask whether the contents of the phenomenology of agency are normally veridical. It is an interesting question in part because a lot of people, a lot of psychologists and neuroscientists write books which sell a lot of copies where they say the contents of the phenomenology of agency are illusory, they're non-veridical. Third question is one that is not often asked, maybe in part because it's very difficult to answer. It's a question about the relationship between agency itself, between being an action or being an agent, and the phenomenology of agency. How are these things related? Is there an essential, is there a deep connection between the two, or are they related in a contingent manner? I'm going to look at that question again. So here's the kind of statement by scientists which prompted my interest in this topic. So Daniel Wegner, psychologist at Harvard, some of you will have read his book. His book says, "It seems to each of us that we have conscious will, it seems to be of selves, it seems to be of minds, it seems to be our agents, it seems to be called what we do. Although it is sobering and ultimately accurate to call all this an illusion, it is a mistake to conclude that the illusion is trivial. On the contrary, the illusions pile atop apparent mental causation, the building blocks of human psychology and social life." And Wegner's not alone in saying things like this. Libet says various things, Benjamin Libet says things that sound a bit like this at times, and other psychologists like John Barr say similar things. The idea is that we experience ourselves as agents in ways which are fundamentally mistaken, misguided. Which of course raises the question, how do we experience ourselves as agents? Some assumptions for this talk. When I gave this talk, I've given this talk once before, I thought these assumptions were obvious, so I didn't even spell them out. And we spent 40 minutes in the discussion time discussing these. So, I'm happy to talk about them, but let me be honest about the approach I'm taking. I'm assuming that there is a phenomenology of agency. There's something it's like to be an agent and to perform actions. And I'm assuming that what it's like can be captured in terms of representational content. In the same way that the phenomenology of vision or auditory experience or tactile experience can be captured in representational content. So the views I'm rejecting are two. One, that what it's like to be an agent involves only beliefs about your agency. Sort of a doxastic approach. It does involve beliefs, but I think it involves more than beliefs. I think it involves representational content. Non-doxastic representational content. I'm also assuming that there's something that's like to be an agent which doesn't just involve experiences about your movement. So you might say, well, there's something it's like to be an agent to pick up a cup of coffee, move your hands about, but that only involves an experience of movement. There's nothing above and beyond the experience of movement involved in being an agent. I'm assuming that view is also false. And one reason for making these assumptions is, I think they're supported by what people with pathologies of agency say. So here's a quote from someone with schizophrenic delusion of control who says, "My fingers pick up the pen, but I don't control them. What they do has nothing to do with me." Now, it seems to me natural to read this as a statement of abnormal or aberrant phenomenology of agency. It's not just that this person has unusual beliefs about their agency, although they perhaps do. Perhaps they have delusional beliefs. It's not just that they have abnormal experiences about their movements. In fact, it may be that their experience of their movements are in fact normal. I mean, they feel their fingers picking up the pen from the inside. So it may be that their experience of movement is normal. But there's something that's abnormal, something which we can call generically phenomenology of first-person agency, which is long-winded, so we'll just call it phenomenology of agency. So, what is the phenomenology of agency like? Chris Frith says somewhere that it's thin, recessive, and active. So I just want to warm us up by thinking through these three labels. It's thin. Seems to me that phenomenology of agency generally contains less content. It's less rich than, say, the contents of perceptual phenomenology. And one manifestation of this thinness, and this paucity of content, is the kind of beliefs that the phenomenology of agency supports are generally fairly simple. So contrast what it's like to be an agent with what it's like to see things. We can see lots of different hues. We can see lots of different shades of color. We can see lots of different textures, patterns in objects. And that can support a range of complex beliefs. But when it comes to the experience of being an agent, I mean, I experience myself as picking up this cup. But you ask me, well, what more is going on? There's a little bit more, but not a lot more, it seems to me. And certainly there isn't the variety and the deep, rich structure, the texture that there is in the context of normal perception. So there's something, I think, to the idea that phenomenology of agency is thin. It's recessive. We don't normally attend to the contents of experience. We perhaps attend to the world that we're manipulating, the objects we're picking up. We attend to the cup when we're trying to pick it up, the door when we're trying to open it. But we don't normally attend to what it's like to be an agent. But it seems to me that we can, if we try to.
Yeah. Just a clarification. I mean, is that the recessive thesis? Is it different from the transparency thesis applied to phenomenology, or isn't it? I mean, could not one think of really the transparency of experience in the case of visual perception, right? As just exactly an instance of the recessive thesis in general, or not?
I'm thinking them as slightly different in that the transparency thesis I take to be the claim that we see through our experiences to the world, but to their representational objects. With the recessive, the notion of content being recessive, I understand that to be sort of the opposite of falling within your attentional focus. So I think that the object. Well, you can go either way. And I was sort of slipping back and forth between attending to the contents of the experience, attending to the experience, and attending to the objects of the experience. So take visual experience. Take vision. I'm attending to this piece of paper right now. But I claim, it seems to me, that there are components of my visual experience which are recessive in that they're kind of there, but they're not falling within the focus of attention.
The periphery?
The periphery, yeah. The periphery.
Not focal.
Not non-focal. So by recessive here I mean non-focal. So I think of this as orthogonal to the question as whether it's transparent or not. Although how one couches this point depends on what one makes of the transparency. Yeah. And I was kind of, sometimes I'm talking about experiences, sometimes talking about the objects of the experience. Yeah.
Just a question for clarification about thinness. Doesn't this depend upon how we describe the action? Suppose I'm a painter, and what I am doing is painting using a paint which has a certain shade of green. Now, if I have that as a characterization of the action, then that is going to be as rich as perceptual experience. If that is included in the description of the action itself.
Right.
So I don't really understand the thinness of this.
Okay. The way I'm thinking of your example is that it's kind of cheating.
Well, that's probably right, given who I am.
No,
My
if,
ethnic background.
it's certainly true. If you're individuating actions in terms of kinds of consequences you're trying to bring about, then painting a green stripe with this hue is going to be a different action from painting a green stripe with that hue. And so there are as many kind of actions as there may be. I mean, for each perceptual experience, you can have a matching point of action. Right. I mean, I'm just trying to
Yeah.
yeah.
Cheating going on.
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the subject side of those actions. That is the sense of being an agent, which it seems to me is going to be in common to each of those actions, irrespective of the hue that you're trying to paint.
I mean, that's important to my action as a painter. I very, very carefully pick out that particular hue and dip my paintbrush in that hue and carefully apply it with this kind of particular stroke on the canvas. And that is essential, it seems to me, for that particular action that I am attending to that particular hue. It seems to me that is going to be a different action if I use a different hue.
I can see that. I grant that. What I'm trying to get at is the sense in which there's something in common to all of those.
Even if you include the brush and the reaching,
So clarification was.
you need a
different word.
bracketing.
I do need a prince. No, I mean I grant that. There's some intuition here that's a different question. But I'm not at the moment sure exactly how to bracket that. No, but I take the point that I'm on notice as needing to give you a criterion, a way to bracket them. Okay. So if you didn't like those two, you're really not going to like what I have to say about the third one. I thought that's the uncontroversial part of it. Okay, active. Here's where I think things get very, very interesting and tricky. In what sense is the phenomenology of agency itself active? Now, one way to think about this issue is in terms of direction of fit. So we can use Searle's notion of a direction of fit. And here's the question I want to raise. Is the direction of fit of experiences of agency the sort of direction of fit that beliefs and perception have, where the mind ought to fit the world? So the world is a certain way, belief, perception, satisfied when it represents the world as it is, or is it that of attentions, where the world ought to fit the mind? Now, to put my cards on the table, it seems to me that the direction of fit is that of belief and perception. That, I mean, insofar as experiences of agency are a type of perceptual state, that's how I'm thinking of them, then they're satisfied when they represent the agent. So the world here includes the agent and their actions the way they are. And they're not satisfied, that is, they're non-vertical, when they misrepresent the structure of the agent and his or her actions. Searle, as far as I can tell, seems to think the direction of fit goes the other way, which I think is very surprising. He seems to suggest that the direction of fit for experience of agency is that of intentions. That is, the world ought to fit experiences of agency. So here's some quotes. The intentional content of the intention in action, which is a type of intention, and the experience of acting are identical. Indeed, insofar as intentionality is concerned, the experience of acting just is intention in action. So if the experience of acting, phenomenology of agency, just is the intention of action, then it's going to have the same direction and fit the same conditions of satisfaction. Here's some other quotes which perhaps make the point. Well, it's a slightly different point, so let me just make this one and then move on. It seems to me that this is wrong. It seems to me that the experience of acting is satisfied when it represents the agent and their actions the way they are. So it's what I think Searle's confused is the objects of experience of acting and the experience of acting, volitional experience itself. Sorry?
Possible to interrupt once more?
Sure.
I think in favor of,
Yeah.
it's a deep and it's just a very complicated issue. But on Searle's view, it's simply impossible for a zombie to have an intention in action, right? I mean, to have, if...
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I mean, how, if the content of the experience of an agent is just the content of the intention in action, that's I think it entails
Yeah.
that you couldn't have an intention in action unless you experienced the having of the experience in action.
No,
Unless you were conscious of having it, right?
Right.
You were aware of it.
That's what you might think, but he actually says, it looks like he should say that, but he doesn't, because he says, although they share the same intentional content, you can have intention and action without having the experience of agency. I think on the handout there's a quote where I say that. So he wants to allow zombies to have intention and action. But if you have the experience of action, then the content of that is going to be the content of an intention and action. The details do get quite... I've got the quote somewhere else if it's not here. Yeah.
So there's another salient point I want to make here,
Which is to do with the self-referential nature of experiences of acting.
Searle makes another point. He actually makes it in two places. He says, the content of the experience of acting is that there is a movement of my arm. Okay? So far I agree. And it is self-referential in the sense that unless the movement is caused by this experience, the conditions of satisfaction do not obtain. I do not actually raise my arm. So it is part of the content of the experience of acting that the experience of acting itself has to be causally involved in the raising of your arm. He says the same thing a little bit earlier. The direction, this should be of causation. The direction of causation is from the experience of acting to the event. Where the intentional causation is satisfied, that is, where I actually succeed in raising my arm, the experience of acting causes my arm to go up. If it didn't cause the arm to go up, but something else did, I didn't raise my arm, it just went up for some other reason. Now here's just a little aside for people who are interested. Although you'll never find anything as sophisticated as this in people like Libet or Wegner, I think you can make sense of what they say of a lot of their experiments by thinking that they assume something like this. That is, that the experience of acting itself has to be causally involved in action. And if it's not, if you can trace the causal path by means of which an action occurs, such that the experience of acting doesn't play a role in that causal path, then you've shown that the experience of acting is non-vertical, misrepresents the structure of agency. Now this, just as an analysis of the content of agency, the experience of agency, this seems to me wrong. It seems to me that the intention to raise my arm might be causally self-referential. So if my arm goes up, but not in virtue of my intention to raise my arm, then the intention is not satisfied. But I don't want to identify the content of the experience of acting with the intention itself. Put things another way. Seems to me that my experience of acting doesn't represent itself as causing my arm to go up. My experience of acting represents my intentions as causing my arm to go up. But it doesn't say anything about its own role in the causal chain.
So do you accept that there is a phenomenology of intention, or do you simply reject the idea
No, I think there is. What?
that we do
That's,
something else?
that's the next jump off the bus. Yeah. But I think there is a phenomenology of intention, but I don't think it's got the content that Cyril's trying to presents to us. Okay. So this is to say what I just said. My intentions might represent themselves as causing my arm to go up, but I don't think that my experiences of agency represent themselves as causing my arm to go up. Okay. That, I think there's a lot in there that's controversial, so we can talk about that in the question time. Okay, what are the contents of the phenomenology of agency? What kind of states are included here? Well, here's a list of some of the things that you might include. First is the experience that François just mentioned, the experience of intentionality or purposiveness. I'm intending to raise my cup. It's a sense of intentionality pervades our actions. There's an experience of authorship. I feel that I'm the author of my actions, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that later on. There's something I've called the experience of liberty, which gets invoked in the free will debate. You might call it the experience of free will. What exactly that is, $64 million euro question, but there's something that deserves that name, whatever the name we use. I'll use liberty. There's an experience of effort. Some things are difficult to do. Some days it's hard to get out of bed. Some days it's hard to do your tax return. Right? Some things take effort. There's an experience of trying, which got talked a lot about in the action literature in the 70s, and then everyone got sick and tired of it. But I think it's an interesting experience. Think about trying to remember the name of the first pet that you had, or where you went, what you did on your 10th birthday. There's something it's like to try to remember something, even when you don't succeed. There's an experiential feeling associated with trying to do something. Mental, in this case, a mental action. There's an experience of deliberation, weighing things up, trying to decide. Now, there's a question. Are all these experiences distinct? Or are some of them actually just one experience? We've got different names, different terms for what's in fact a single experience. And if they are distinct, how are they related? Can you have one without the other? And for each of these experiences, we can ask, what are their conditions of satisfaction? So take 6, the experience of deliberation. There's an experience of deliberating, trying to decide where to eat tonight. What are the conditions of satisfaction for that experience? What does it take to really deliberate? And can you experience yourself deliberating and actually not be deliberating? You just think you are. Or can you experience yourself, can you deliberate but not realize that you're deliberating, not experience yourself as deliberating? Obviously there's a lot to be said here. I'm going to ignore 3, 4, 5, and 6 and focus just on 1 and 2. So what I want to do now, which is the next one. Yeah.
But the last thing is,
No.
I'm sure on your view it's possible to have the experience of deliberation but not believe that you're deliberating. And therefore, in some sense, right? I mean, I'm saying, but on your view it should be possible to have the experience of without believing that you're deliberating.
At least
you might not be alive that you're deliberating, even though you have the experience of deliberation. Is that your view?
there's 3 things that might come apart.
Mm.
One is deliberating itself. One is the experience of deliberating. And one is the belief that you're deliberating.
These are 3 things.
These are at least conceptually. At least conceptually. So if you want to say, you can't, if you want to say these things go together necessarily, then I think you need an argument, because they're at least conceptually distinct. Okay, so here's a proposal concerning the basic structure of what it's like to be an agent. And I call this a proposal. I mean, I think it's out there in the literature. I think people often assume it. And it's a useful target to try and clarify our ideas. So here's the idea. The experience of authorship, feeling of being an agent, is derived from the experience of ownership of efficacious intentions. So, effort, freedom, decision-making, deliberation, these are all non-essential. They're bells and they're whistles. That's the fancy stuff. The basic structure of being phenomenology of agency is I am aing, so I am picking up a cup, which can be analyzed in some senses. I am moving in a way that is directly caused by and satisfies my intention to a, that is, satisfies my intention to pick up a cup. And you might add, this movement is caused by the intention to a in virtue of the intention having the content that it does. The basic idea is this. What lies at the heart of phenomenology of agency is the experience of causally efficacious intentions. And everything else sort of gets analyzed in terms of causally efficacious intentions. That's the idea. So the experience of mental causation lies at the heart of what it is to experience yourself as an agent. And I think, just to tie this back to some of the cognitive science literature, I think people like Chris Frith, Daniel Wegner, assume this model. It's hard to find it explicit in the work, but I think they assume something like this. Now what's nice about this is it gives you a handle on how you might explain pathologies in phenomenology of agency, such as the anarchic hand or delusions of control seen in schizophrenia. There's two ways you might explain such pathologies. One is people fail to experience their movements as having mental causes. So they're aware of their hands moving, I'm aware of my hand going up, but I don't experience that as caused by or satisfying my intention to drink. I have no awareness of mental antecedents of the event. Or perhaps the pathology involves an awareness of the mental antecedents, the mental causes, but no sense that the mental states of mind. I'm aware of the intention, but I don't feel it's my intention, so I don't experience the action as my action. So you've got a nice story about pathologies of agency. Okay, I'm going to go through 4 problems with this proposal. Some of them I'm just going to raise, and we can talk about in discussion. To go through them in detail will take too long. First problem, what do we do with mental agency? It seems that there's a category of mental acts. Some people think this is contentious, but I think perhaps most of you, well, I hope most of you agree, there's such a thing as mental doings, mental events. In fact, Joel's got some nice stuff on mental actions. And it's not clear how this proposal deals with the phenomenology of mental agency, because there's no awareness of the movement. I mean, there's no awareness of mental movement, so how can you be aware of prior mental intentions causing movement to explain mental agency if there is no movement? Well, first thing you might say is phenomenology of mental agency is different, has a different character than the phenomenology of picking up a glass. Mental actions are different from physical actions. The phenomenology of mental actions is different from that of physical actions. Second thing you might say is, rather than talking about movements, we could just talk about events, which would bring in mental events. So suppose you're thinking through a problem, the experience of agency there might involve an awareness of the solution to the problem. So you're aware of your intentions as causing a mental event. Not a mental movement, but just happening of some kind. So there are ways you might try and adapt the proposal to deal with mental agency. Let's leave that for discussion. Second problem. what some people call minimal actions. So scratching an itch, right? Tapping your fingers, some people are doing. You might think there's a kind of phenomenology of agency there, right? Wiggling your toes when you're listening to a talk. There's something that's like to perform minimal actions, but you've got no awareness of that movement as caused by a prior intention. So you've just got the bare phenomenology of agency. If that's the case, then the proposal fails as an analysis of the experience of agency, because there's no awareness of that event as having a mental cause. So that's the second problem. Third problem comes from an adaptation of Davidson's famous case by Davidson's unfortunate climber. A climber might want to rid himself of the weight and danger of holding another man on a rope. He might know that by loosening his hold on the rope, he could rid himself of the weight and danger. This belief in want might so unnerve him as to cause him to loosen his hold. So he's aware that he can do this. He's aware that in some sense he wants to do this. He becomes very nervous. He starts sweating. This causes him to loosen his hold. And yet it might never be the case, might be the case that he never chose to loosen his hold, nor did he do it intentionally. But Davidson introduced this case as a problem for causal theories of action. I want to discuss it as a problem for analyses of the causal analyses of phenomenology of action. So my case is one in which Davidson's climber doesn't experience himself as letting go of the rope. But he does experience the letting go of the rope as having mental causes. He's aware that he has the belief. He's aware that he has the want. He may even be aware that he has the intention. He just hasn't quite decided to act on it. But he intends at some time in the future, perhaps, to let go of the rope. And he's aware of that. And he's aware that because he has the intention, he's sweating, and that's caused him to let go of the rope. But he never experiences himself as the agent of the letting go of the rope. He doesn't experience letting go of the rope as an action. So I want this to be a counterexample to the proposal, that is to an analysis of agency in terms of mental causation.
So does that generalize to cases of deviant causal chains, such as this one? Would you generalize that to, would you say that cases of deviant causal chains which are so to say inwards are cases of lack of phenomenology of action?
I think so, although I'm worried that you might be going somewhere.
No, because that's a particular case of deviant causal
That's right.
chain.
That's right.
I wonder whether it could apply to others. For instance, there is Chris Peacock's example of Freud's servant who wants to break a vase of his psychologist, of his master, and on purpose wants to do it, but he is ruled by unconscious beliefs and desires, and so in the end he breaks it without him. So
Yeah. My intuition is that the deviant cases are in part deviant because of phenomenological deviance. And that's our fix on what, and when we have a deviant case and when we have a non-deviant case, is in part, it would feel deviant. So I think that's an intuition. I don't have an argument for that. Okay, problem 4. Okay. So we had problem 2 and 3. Problem 2 was this idea of minimal actions. We seem to have the phenomenology of agency, but we don't experience them as having mental causes. Problem 3 was this Davidson's unfortunate climber, which is the converse. He does have the phenomenology of mental causation, but he doesn't experience authorship. He doesn't have a sense of
the event being an action. Now, there's a lot you could say about what's going wrong in this Davidson case. But you could say, well, the phenomenology of causation is wrong. There's different types of causation, and he experiences one type of causation, but that's not the right type of proposal. We could talk about that in the discussion, but another line of response might be to say the intentions are the wrong type of intentions. So rather than feel just a prior intentions to let go of the rope, we might say what you need to think about is more specific intentions, roughly intentions in action, more fine-grained intentions, intentions to do things here and now. And now it's kind of harder to get a counterexample to the proposal. It's harder to get the kind of Davidson case that you want.
Well, yes, you can have a failed intention reaction which causes the right sort of movements.
So,
I
yeah,
don't know why you couldn't rephrase the example with failed intention selection.
okay. So you experience. So the case would be you experienced a failed intention in action causing the event, but you don't. And you don't have, so you have the phenomenology of mental causation, but you don't have the experience of that being an action.
Because in your proposal you have
Yeah.
two components. You have causation and satisfaction. So you experience causation, but also you experience the satisfaction of the intention reaction. So you could say that in this example
But
you experience causation but not satisfaction of the intention reaction.
Right.
I really don't see in all this discussion in what sense there is the experience of causation in those deviant cases. There is the experience of the say the intention of sort of mental states that has a certain goal.
Yeah.
There is the intention, there is the awareness of the goal being
Yeah.
fulfilled, and there is the belief that there is this connection.
Right.
But I don't see that there is any experience of causation, and I would think that for causation to be experienced, there has to be something very, very direct. So it's out of, I don't think it's ever possible for one to have the experience of a prior intention causing anything. It's not an experience.
Right.
It may be, so you can have only the experience maybe of an intention in action causing something, but then I don't think we could have the deviant case that Jerome suggests. I think if you really have the experience,
Yeah.
or you might maybe have the illusory experience, but then you wouldn't know.
I mean, you can experience trying to loosen the rope, and then at the extent that you fail to do that, but nevertheless,
That's what I don't understand.
you're trying causes. I don't know. You have to think about it. But
Yeah.
Anyway, there is this general point. What do you mean by experiencing causation
Yeah. Right.
with the phenomenology and all that? I mean,
It may be that my fourth objection is your objection, perhaps. So let me go to that now. I'm certainly open to the idea that there is a counterexample with intentions in action. I would actually like that to be the case. Because I think the proposal fails, and I would like it to fail. This is in line with your. If there is no counterexample to the intention and action mind, that would be strange, because intentions and action, as I understand them, they're just intentions. They're just fine-grained intentions, and they're intentions to do something here and now. But they have the same structure, the same logical form as intentions. They're a kind of intention. So if you can get a counterexample with intentions, you can't get a counterexample with intentions and action. That would need explaining.
But if you experience the failing, that the intention of an action fails, as in if you sense that it fails, then you're quite clearly seeing that it doesn't cause the outcome. So I don't see how you could both experience the causation and experience the absence of the causation. It seems to be sort of contradiction there.
because once again,
You're causing a movement. Even though you feel an intention, you still committed something.
But are you experiencing
You can
it
experience
as
the
caused by
movement.
this?
Of course, if you trip on something, you are feeling your intention, but still you experience that you are doing something to furniture or whatever.
So what the
But
proposal,
is it the intention that
No, the experience.
No, it's not the intention. It's
But you experience causality in your movement. So it's
Or
a
you-
level of
you-
causality experience.
I can try to.
yeah, something causes something. But the question is it the intention in action that causes, or is it that there is a chain, as it were, a sort of causal chain?
Also, I can try to put off the cup and then very clumsily do it like that, and the cup falls.
Yeah.
So my intention in action has failed. But I'm aware that the intention in action has caused.
Well, that's what I deny. What I
I
cause the thing
think, I
is.
think that's probable forces.
It may be prominent, but we'll find out. But Jerome, I mean, your point is a very useful one because what the proposal should say is that you experience, right, well, it does say, it does say that you experience the intention and action as causing in virtue of satisfying its content. And that's what that's what some counterexamples with the Davidson point might not do. And I need them both. Okay, so problem 4 is, and I'm not sure if this is your word, control or not. There's a very interesting question of whether we ever experience mental causation in a really causal sense at all. So here are 3 quotes which I have a lot of sympathy with. First from Hogan, Tietzen, and Grimm. It seems patently clear that one does not normally experience one's own actions as causal processes consisting in the causal generation of bodily motion by chronic mental events. So they resist a causal analysis of intentionality. You might experience your movements, your bodily motions, as realizing or satisfying your intentions, but not as caused by your mental events. That's it.
That's simply the question that he asks his question against self. You know, he says just the reverse. Where is the argument?
Well, actually, Cyril actually says something very similar to this.
Well, he says that it's part of the, you know, of the intentional content with a big I, of an intention that causes it.
But no, they can grant that, they can grant a causal theory of action. Their claim is about phenomenology of intentionality.
But
So-
for some, it's really a phenomenological effect, you know, the
Well-
actual contact.
No, I mean, Cyril actually changes his mind, I think. What he says in intentionality is along those lines. In, what is it, rationality in action? There's only two lectures. I take it back. In his more recent book, he says, actually, I think I have a quote in the handout. Maybe I took it out because the handout was too long. Actually, it's the one quote I took out. No, he says we don't experience our mental states as causing our actions. So Cyril's view is not clear. Well, it's not clear that it's consistent. Here's Wakefield and Dreyfus. Think of walking along a familiar path absorbed in thought. There's the dim feeling of doing something, of walking, but that experience is not the experience of a representation of the goal of walking causing the walking. There's no sense of one's representations causing your actions. Yeah, okay, so I just had the 2 quotes here. There's a few more in the handout. But there are folks who say, sure, there's an intentionality, there's a purposiveness to experience, but it's not causal. It doesn't have a causal component. Now, I think I agree with you, Joel, in the sense that there's no argument here, right? And so if someone comes along and says, yeah, sure, there's a causal, right? When I pick up the cup, I experience my intentions as causing my arm to go up. We have a standoff. I mean, we have, you say X and I say not X. For what it's worth, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that it's not a straightforward causal. That the character of intentionality or purposiveness is an oomphy causal. You don't feel compelled.
And I think there's something, I mean, here's the beginnings of an argument, perhaps. Think of certain pathologies of agency, such as certain cases perhaps of addiction, and what some people say about Tourette syndrome, where people do feel compelled or forced to perform a certain act. There you might say there is the phenomenology of being caused by your mental states. I can't but help, people say. I feel caused to do this. I have these urges which I can't resist. Now, I'm not sure what to make of that kind of data, because even folks with Tourette syndrome say, I do the tic. So when they have a Tourettic tic, they say, I have these really strong urges. But the intention to act on the urge is something that I don't feel caused by. I act on it, but I don't experience myself as caused to act by my urges. I can refrain. And you might say that even in cases of addiction, well, here's the question. What is the phenomenology of addiction? Is it that you feel caused to act by your intentions? Or perhaps caused to form certain intentions by your desires? Or is it that you have these internal states? They're very strong, they're vivid, they don't go away, but there's no feeling of being caused to act by them in the way that there's an experience of this cup causing that cup to move. Certainly, it doesn't seem to be a causal experience in that way. It's not billiard ball causation, or the phenomenology doesn't seem to be that of billiard ball causation. Okay, second last major point. How are we doing with the time? We have another hour. Okay, so now I want to say something about authorship experiences. First, there's a terminological issue. Some people talk about the experience of the self as a source of one's actions. The action is deriving from the self. Some people talk about authorship experiences. Sometimes people talk about the experience of agent causation. I'm going to use authorship experience because I think it's the most neutral. It's not theoretically loaded like the others. And I think there's two models here. There's two ways of thinking about this. One is an agent causal account, which does appeal to a notion of the agent as the cause. So in picking up the cup, I don't experience my mental states as causing the action, I experience myself as the cause of the action. That's what some people want to say. Other people want to say, what we can call the experience of authorship is actually an experience of event causation. And it's really, this is in line with what I call the basic proposal, it's really an experience of the movement caused by a mental state which you experience as your own. That's all there is to authorship. There's no sense of the self as the origin or the cause of the event. What passes for authorship? Authorship comes in the back door in terms of ownership of the intention which is experienced as generating the action. Now, I don't want to argue for one or other of these models. I just want to sort of lay them out as two possibilities. Obviously, the first ties in nicely with a very controversial position in the free will literature, the idea that we are agent causes. Although it needn't be committed to the libertarian conception that agent causation is often committed to. And the second obviously ties in with what I call the basic proposal. The second is kind of reductionistic or even what's deflationary about the experience of the self. You don't need to wheel in a substantive self. You can do all the work in characterizing phenomenology in terms of mental causation. So life would be easier, I think, if the second model were true. the event causal account were true. Maybe life isn't easier. Maybe phenomenologically, there's some truth to the first. I actually think that there is some truth to the first, but the phenomenology here is very difficult to decide. For what it's worth, here's someone in the free will literature who's appealing to the phenomenology of agent causation. Agent causation, O'Connor says, is appealing because it captures the way we experience our own activity. So here's the claim. It does not seem to me that I am caused to act by the reasons to favor doing so. It seems to be the case rather that I produce my own decisions in view of those reasons. So the I here is experienced as a source of origin, causal point of origin. Now, I mean, as with any introspective report, you can ask yourself whether you think this is true of your own experience. It's not an argument, it's just one introspective report. But I think there's something to it. And here's another one by Holden Bayne. Your phenomenology presents your own behavior to you as having yourself as its source, rather than presenting your own behavior to you as having your own mental events as its source. Now, it's consistent with that to say our behavior does have our mental events as its source. But if one says that, then there's this weird disconnection between the phenomenology of mental causation and the actual structure of mental causation. So you're left in a rather uncomfortable position. Yes?
I missed that.
Yeah.
Could you just
Sure. Suppose these guys are right. Suppose it's true, not just true of them, but true of us all, that our phenomenology presents our own behavior as having ourselves as its source, rather than having our own mental states as its source. What would happen to theories of mental causation, which say, to the causal theory of action, which says that our actions are caused by our mental states? And you've got there's no place in those theories for the self as the cause, not for ourself. I mean, there's an indirect place, in fact, it's my mental states. You would have a very weird disconnection between the phenomenology of action as presented by these folks and the actual structure of action. And one would be led to the conclusion that there's something systematically misleading about the phenomenology of action.
No.
That's the thought.
What do you think of that? David Benneman's cases in which you act on beliefs and desires, but with which you don't fully identify yourself. So you could have both phenomenologies. I mean, phenomenology in which you feel like that you identify with the beliefs and desires of the underlying action, and other cases in which you...
Sure. Well, that's one way to have both. One way to have both is sometimes this is right, and that you feel the action has, you identify with it, you feel that it has yourself as a source. And other times it has its own mental, you experience the event as having your own mental states. But there's still a tension between someone who says, I mean, I think these guys want to say normally, sort of all the time, this is the case. And then mental analyses, causal analyses of action, in terms of mental states, say, no, normally actions have mental events as their source. I mean, ideally, you want a way to reconcile the two so that a particular action can have both. Yeah?
I'm sorry, as a psychologist, I'm a little bit confused. Doesn't mental state implies itself? I don't understand the distinction between mental state and self.
I mean, I agree that it does, insofar as mental states are states of myself, or your mental states are states of yourself.
What I think these guys are trying to get at is the idea that actions are caused by you as an object in some sense, rather than caused by your states. Now you might think that that claim doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think a lot of philosophers would be tempted by that claim. That there is no self. If there is a self over and above its states, then the self can't have any causal role.
But it's in the phenomenology. Their claim is about the phenomenology, not about reality.
Well, right. Although you might think that if the concept doesn't make any sense, you might be worried that the phenomenology, you couldn't have phenomenology with that representational content if that content isn't there to be had. You might think that. Yeah.
I think Joe disagrees.
Yeah. Is that an objection? Or?
It's the French style.
Am I allowed to speak as well?
Not if you don't have a car.
On your own account, a mental state like an intention, for example, and the experience of having that intention or intending are two different things. Right?
Yeah.
Now, the way people like Horgan, Knudsen, and Graham present the content of the phenomenology, right, suggests that you could not have that phenomenology unless you had the concept of the self. Right? I mean, unless I couldn't have a particular phenomenological experience of my behavior as being caused or as a source of self, unless I had the various concepts of the self. Right? Now, I'm not even we may grant that.
It may
right?
not have to be a concept. It's something.
Well, you need.
It needs to be able to enter into representational content. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So
now, okay, so if we are interested in what kind of representational resources are required for the phenomenology at all, certainly that issue is different from the goal of any kind of scientific or objective philosophical, psychological, scientific goal of explaining actions, which is, in a sense, the target of the causal theory of action, combining philosophical, conceptual, and scientific elements, right? I mean, certainly the target of the causal theory of action is not to capture the phenomenology. It's to provide a means for some kind of objective third-person understanding. So why should that theory put pressure on the content of the phenomenology, and vice versa? We might be very interested in the kind of resources required for the phenomenology, but certainly the goal of the causal theory is a very different kind of a goal, right?
I agree with that, but I still think there are various connections between the two enterprises. So here's one: you might appeal to the phenomenology of agency to provide evidence for a causal theory of action. You might not, but you might.
That might not.
It's not the only kind of evidence you might have. So that, and if these guys are right, then there is no such evidence to be found in the phenomenology of agency, or at least that's the first one.
I'm sorry, just to press you, I can imagine a context in which one would like to provide an account of the phenomenology in the following context. Are you the source, or is somebody else the source? If that's the context for the tracking of the phenomenology, right, then whether what matters is the representation of the self as opposed to beliefs, intentions, desires, and mental states, that might be irrelevant, because what's now being what's really the topic is whether an agent has the phenomenal sense of himself being the source, as opposed to an alien, somebody else being himself.
Right.
And then the question of distinguishing self and non-trace is not a relevant question. I mean, and I can interpret Morgan, Keeton, and Graham to actually, provide an account of the phenomenology in the context of that question.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then, why bring the total theory of action at all in the picture? That would not be the relevant kind of, would not be an alternative type of analysis.
Yeah, it'd be consistent.
Right, I mean, no?
I think we
I
agree.
mean, right, okay. I mean, the kind of question where that claim might arise is, was the action spontaneous or was it externally generated? Evidence that is being studied by. Well, is it not? I'm sorry. Excuse me. Pardon. I thought we did movement. Excuse me. I mean, since you're in movement,
Yeah.
you gave the
Sorry,
signal.
everyone.
Sorry.
It's- I think these issues point in two directions. One is a cognitive science kind of question. So what are the mechanisms by means of which this phenomenology is generated, and how might they map onto the structure of agency as being portrayed by cognitive science? There's another, and it's a very different literature. Another literature which this hooks up with, which is the kind of the free will metaphysics literature. So when someone like Chisholm says, each of us when we act is a prime mover or unmoved. In doing what we do, was this the Jean-Luc lecture? In doing what we do, we cause certain events to happen, and nothing or no one causes us to cause those events to happen. So here, this is deep into metaphysics land, right? He wants a very controversial conception of the self and of free will. Now, there's nothing here about the phenomenology of agency, but I bet you that if you would ask Chisholm, what's the evidence? At least one line of evidence he would appeal to is, that's what it feels like. Now, how to map this on with anything a psychologist might be doing, that would be a hard, but so that this is one direction in which this issue is placed. Okay, last section which is relevant to cognitive science. Here's the question I want to ask here is, when are experiences of authorship vertical? So sometimes I experience myself as the author of what I'm doing, and sometimes I don't. What are the conditions of satisfaction for such experiences? Obviously, this question is related to, well, what is the self? What is the self? But I want to get at this by contrasting two pairs of pathologies of authorship. So first you can contrast Penfield actions with Delgado actions. Penfield actions, many of you know, Welder Penfield, Canadian neurosurgeon, doing brain surgery, and stimulated various parts of the brain, and his patients performed various simple movements. They would reach out, they would say a word, something fairly simple. And they seemed to have no phenomenology of authorship. They would say things like, I didn't do that, you did. They felt caused to move rather than movers. Delgado actions are interestingly different and interestingly similar. Delgado was also a neuroscientist, neurosurgeon, also directly stimulating the brain. And I'm not sure exactly what parts I should know. But in his case, the actions were experienced as authored. His subject said, yeah, I'm raising my arm so I can ask for a cup of water. And they confabulated intentions. Or they opened the door, moved towards the door. So here you have, in some sense, actions or movements which have very similar etiologies. Different parts of the brain are stimulated,
But in no case does the action arise out of the patient's or the person's long-term goals, plans. In some sense, the action is caused by the neural stimulation. The story is more complicated, but you have actions which are similar in their structure, but very different phenomenology, voltage. One case the person says, I did it. The other case they say, I don't feel like I altered that. And prima facie, you might say, someone's got to be wrong. If the Delgado person, well, here's the question. Did they do the action or not? Did they alter the action or not? If you want to say, for the Penfeld action, no, they didn't alter the action. I mean, someone's sticking an electrode in their head. Come on. They moved their arm, but that wasn't their action. It was caused by the electrical stimulation. Then I think you should probably say the same thing about the Delgado group. At the very least, it's a nice pair of examples to think about when someone is the author, when they stand in the doing relation to a movement. So, if Penfield patients altered their actions, then Delgado did, subjects did, and vice versa. Second pair of contrasts. Consider the anarchic hand and utilization behavior. Patients with an anarchic hand will engage in grasping, reaching behavior. They will respond to affordances in the immediate perceptual environment. So the hand might pick up my iPod, might try and change my PowerPoint. And patients with an anarchic hand will not experience the phenomenology of authorship. They will say it's got a will of its own. They'll try and sit on the hand. They will refer to the hand in the third person. They seem to not experience the movements of the hand as their own actions. Patients with utilization or imitation behavior also respond to perceptual affordances. If there's some glasses here, we'll put on a pair of glasses. If there's a cup, we'll drink the water even if they're not thirsty. Actions are triggered by environmental affordances. But they don't say, I can't help myself, I'm not doing these things. They appear to have an intact sense of phenomenology of agency. So again, we have similar kinds of routes to action here, such that if anarchic hand movements are altered, if they're actions that are altered by the patient, then utilization behavior is altered by the patient. I mean, if the person with anarchic hand is picking up the cup, if that's their action, then the utilization person, patient with utilization behavior, is also picking up the cup. But in one case we have the phenomenology of authorship, in the other case we don't. Someone's got to be wrong about whether or not they're the author of their actions. So the more general question here is this. What is the relationship between the phenomenology of agency and actions? Can you perform an action without experiencing yourself as performing it? Can you get it wrong about whether or not you're the author? And let me just finish with teasing apart this thought a little bit. Sometimes when people talk about actions, they have a thick conception of action, such that the phenomenology of agency is essential to whether or not it's an action. So Fritz says, by definition, we must be aware of our willed actions. And I think by aware he means have the phenomenology of will. If you ain't got the phenomenology, it ain't a willed action. Regner says, without an experience of willing, even actions that look voluntary from the outside fall short of qualifying as truly willed. So essential to the fact, to being a willed action, that it be experienced as such. So it's a thick conception. Thin conception would say that whether or not the action is willed is one thing, whether it's experienced as willed is another. So some people writing in hypnosis literature say the responses of hypnotized individuals can be voluntary, even when they're not experienced as voluntary. So that's a contingent relationship. There's the phenomenology of agency here, and there is intentional objects that can come apart. Wegner, same fellow, says, it appears possible to produce voluntary action through brain stimulation, with or without an experience of conscious will. Now hold on, didn't he just say, without an experience of willing, even actions that look entirely voluntary from the outside still fall short of qualifying with free will? So how can it be possible to produce voluntary action through brain stimulation with or without an experience of conscious will? Well, he's confused, obviously, but he's just not sure. And I think a lot of us aren't sure. Can you really have a voluntary or a willed action without the experience of volitional will? Or is there an essential and necessary connection between the two?
Once again, if you can different kinds of action.
You could.
Action which requires some kind of explicit experience of affecting, and other actions more automatic, which are still will, but which don't require the same level of awareness for themselves.
Yeah. So let's talk about that in this one. Anyway, so finished. That's Dr. Strangelove for the next. You could say there is a type of action, and you could call that a willed action, where the action itself can only be willed, only if you have the right phenomenology towards it. But then you thought, isn't that just a terminological stipulation?
I was thinking of something like Norman and Chinese distinction between, I don't remember the terminology, two kinds of actions.
But what role? Here's the way I think about the two kinds of actions. There's the automatic actions, and then there's, I guess, controlled, I think. Now, what role does the phenomenology of control play in that distinction? Could you have something that really is an automatic action, but you feel like you're controlling it? Why not? Right? But in that case, and could you have something that really is a controlled action, but it feels automatic? So if,
nothing to do with phenomenology.
but I mean, I think that's, I don't know the Norman and Shell's paper well enough, but that's one way to go. But then you need another line in the literature says, no, part of what it is to be controlled is to be experienced as controlled. And it's the experience of control which generates the kind of global availability, which generates the functional properties of control actions, such that if an action is not experienced as controlled, it can't be controlled, because it's the phenomenology that does the work. And I think people are not sure in the literature which way they want to go.
What is your view on that? I wasn't clear.
Well, I would...
Whether you
No, what's that?
It's time to wash your hands a
Grubbing.
little
I'm
bit.
grubbing. I'm grubbing. You were trying to make me stop grubbing and become clean. I guess I tend to think that you should keep the phenomenology separate from the structure. So the view I tend to want to take is what we want is we've got the distinction between controlled and automatic action, and then there are separate mechanisms which generate phenomenology. And if they work properly, when an action is controlled, it's experienced as controlled, and when it's automatic, it's experienced as automatic. But there's nothing to be, perhaps they can come apart. Perhaps automatic actions can be experienced as controlled, controlled and experienced as automatic. That's possible. Now, so that's the position I start from.
But if someone can give me an argument as to say, no, the functional role of control action, to have that functional role, you've got to be experienced as control. Then I'd be very interested in, it's entirely possible that there is such a claim, in which case your phenomenology couldn't come apart from the reality in the same way, in the way I was suggesting it now.
One argument in favor is the point about directional fit, because you want the phenomenology of action to have a
Yeah.
mind-to-world directional fit.
I think
Whereas
that
control in this case
is the other way around. Yeah. But I think that
So, could you complete your argument? Let's see how it goes in the question.
I think Tim started with a distinction
Yes,
between.
yes, but what do you conclude from your point?
Sorry?
This is your conclusion.
I think it's an argument for dissociating the experience of controlling your
No dissociation.
what I think the direction of fit gives me is the conceptual room to dissociate. That's why I'm insisting. I mean, that's why I'll bang the table on the direction of it, because I want the conceptual room. I want it to turn out to be conceptually possible that in hypnosis you experience yourself as not engaging in controlled actions, but you're using those mechanisms which people say are controlled. But a conceptual distinction is one thing. If someone says the direction of the phenomenology of agency only goes so far, and that it's not like perception, where, I see the paper as white. That's the experience. The paper being white is something else entirely. The paper can be blue, and I would see it as white, because there can be visual hallucination. And the paper can be white, and I can experience it as blue. But there we have a clear distinction between the objects of vision and visual experience. Action is, the mechanisms of action are right up next to the mechanisms of the experience of action. And it's possible, I want to say, that the way actions unfold involves experiencing the action unfolding in such a way that if the experience is aberrant, the action itself is aberrant. And you don't have the clear distinction between colors of objects and the experience of colors. So I think I see to be two issues. One is direction of fit and condition of satisfaction, which gives you logical structure. And then you have to ask about functional role. And then things become awfully complicated.
Le point est sur cette question,
Okay, yes.
I think if you take the functional role question, control necessitates both directions of fit, because the common part of the control loop involves mind-to-world direction of fit, world-to-mind direction of fit, and the other way around for the monitoring part of the loop, because you need to see how the world is to decide what you must do next. So it's the world as changed by your first command, your previous command, but still you need to have a direction of fit on the other side to go on controlling what you're doing. So I think it's conceptually necessary that you have both ways in the phenomenology.
So one way to go is there are states which have the world-to-mind direction of fit, and there are other states which have the other one, mind-to-world. And control loops involve both. Another model, which sounds like a different model, maybe it's only terminologically different, is there are states which have both directions of fit. And I don't know if I can make sense of that. Yeah, push me forward. I don't know if I understand. everything depends on how we individuate states, I guess. But you're suggesting that there are control states which have both directions of fit.
If you speak control, you have to say that there are two different ways of
Yeah.
forming representations. One is meant to roll, the other is meant to none.
I would like to do it with loops between.
That's it.
Okay.
There is a flexibility in between them.
And the experience of agency involves both kinds of states?
It does, and that's why it brings us back to your first construal of phenomenology at the very beginning of the paper. Because if you consider the two parts of the loop as being united in some sense, I think, as I was thinking, we should, then perceptual experience itself becomes a part of the phenomenology of agency.
Yeah.
Because the very perceptual changes that are occurring in the world either occur as a consequence of reaction or they don't.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a difference in the perceptual phenomenology linked to, for example, is this something I caused or not?
Mm-hmm.
Is it also familiar or expected or not? Which are part of the phenomenology. And I think everyone is having this experience when he moves around.
Yeah.
Things are moving as expected and some are not. And among those that are expected, some are caused by me and some are not.
I completely agree that the contents of perceptual experience, visual, tactile, proprioceptive, intimately feed into phenomenology of agency. And that whether you think you're doing something depends on the structure of visual experience and matching between expectations and what you see. I completely agree. Whether I still want to say that there are separate states of experiences of agency which can be, at least, which can be separated from, say, visual experiences. And I still want to say that experience of agency have a single direction of fit, such that, if you want to say they have both directions of fit, then in order to be satisfied, there has to be two things. One is, so if I experience myself raising the cup, what must be the case for that experience to be satisfied? Really? On your view, well, it must be the case that I am raising my cup with a certain intention. And the experience itself causes the cup to go up.
No, I
Okay.
really feel this.
So what's the other way? So the one way is, the one direction of fit is the one I want, which is
Yes.
the experience is satisfied when it is the case that I stand in the doing relation to my cup going up. But the other direction of fit is the one that intentions have.
Well, when your cup is being raised, you must make sure that it's the cup that you are raising. If you withdraw something else, then your purpose will be defeated.
Right.
And so there is another direction of fit when you have to see whether your intention is satisfied or not. And this time you have to check on what there is in the world. It's not only what you wanted, it's also what is the case.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different direction of fit. It's the monitoring part. The monitoring part has to be passive in the sense that you have to take in what is the fact.
So maybe the question is, what is the monitoring role of the experience of agency? Is it that, what does the monitoring? Is it the experience itself that does the monitoring? Or is it, see, I think of the experience as sending information to a monitor, and the intentions as having the other direction of fit,
Yes.
rather than the experience itself as having the other direction of fit. I think maybe that's what we disagree about.
Is not there a homunculus in your experience of agency that is doing some work there?
Well, if you think there are monitors, then you've got a monitor. Everyone thinks there are monitors.
No, right?
Just a little homunculus.
In the phenomenology, it's important that you experience yourself being in control of causing. So, do you think it's clear that you can experience the causation, or as opposed to believing that you're causing it? Do you think it's a clear matter of fact about phenomenology that you experience it and not just believe that you're causing it?
Yeah.
Because that's a very traditional question about experiencing causation in the external world.
Yeah.
Do you experience it, or is it always just believing?
I think we experience it. I mean, here's why I think that. Take the forgetting the name. The social psychologist, I think it was Austrian, who had the displays where you see the little ball chasing Hyder. You see that. Take those displays. So you see these geometrical figures, and you see a circle chasing a triangle, and then running into it, and the triangle bouncing it off. And you know that this is generated by computer graphics. And you know that the ball is not causing the triangle to run away. You know that the ball is not bouncing into the triangle and causing the triangle to ricochet off. You don't believe there's no correlation, but you experience it. I mean, it just looks like that's what you want to say. So I think you can have the experience without the belief. I mean, this is maybe a slightly less convincing case, but there are people, I mean, take a...
That's a different notion of experience than maybe the one that's at stake when one talks of phenomenology. It's a notion of, I mean, there is certainly a contrast which you are drawing between having this sort of directly, having this information, whether you believe it or not, somehow you are informed of this, and then actually believing, having the thing, that's existence. So that's one distinction. But the distinction between the phenomenology, I mean, the distinction that Matt's drawing between having phenomenological access to this causation relation versus having something more inferential is, I believe, a different contrast.
I want them to be the same. Put it this way, I agree that there's inferential processing involved. I mean, it's, contingency, constant conjunction. There's all the Gestalt rules of which underlie the experience of causation. But I still think of the experience as phenomenologically how what's manifest, what's given. It feels direct. In the same way that the Muller liar, you believe the lines in the Muller liar are the same length. You've measured them. You believe they're the same length, but it doesn't look like it. So I think there's an output of a causal perception mechanism, which operates both for the external world and for internal states. And it's not quite doxastic, although there's a close relation. That's to you.
Well, in a sense, my question has been asked by Sharon about the direction of fit, but let me try to put it in focus on another point. You have excluded from your examination your component number 4 on the phenomenology of agencies, that is the experience of decision making and deliberation.
Yeah.
Now, I take it that sort of paradigmatically, decision making, deliberation, having a piece of practical reasoning is something which has the typical direction of fit of the intentions, which is opposed to the desire. Now, there is sort of strain between your view, which you have just repeated now, that in a sense, I mean, let me put it that way, that would be make it more difficult for your position, that the experience of action is in a sense epiphenomenal. Now, if it is epiphenomenal, and if at the same time there is experience of deliberation, which is supposed to be a paradigmatic case of a direction of fit, which is that of desire, and I always get mixed up mind to world.
Yeah, I always get
then that's a bit hard. So would you say, for instance, like people like Galen-Strawson, that there is this particular phenomenology of to beliefs and to desires, so that deliberation gets its particular feel because of the phenomenology of the kind of doxastic states, for instance, which get into practical reasoning? Well, maybe you should. I think it seems to me that you don't really need to argue that there is an experience of deliberation, given what you say about the role of experience of action. And that's also something which is a bit hard, because you said that it's experience of action is experience of mental causation. So this invites the thought that the very mental causation which is happening at that time has some essential connection with the experience, but at the same time you say that it doesn't. So, where are you?
I think there's three things there. First, what is the structure of the experience of deliberation? How does it relate to, say, experience of mental causation? What is its direction of fit? And then there's sort of the question of, do beliefs and desires have a phenomenology? I think the third question is sort of slightly separate. I mean, I think they do, actually. I think there's something that's like to have a certain belief or have a certain desire. But maybe we can bracket that and come back to it. The question of the direction of the experience of deliberation is, I think, really interesting. Here's what I want to say. That it has the same direction of fit as the other components of the phenomenology of urgency, which is not the direction of fit of desire or intention. It's the other one.
Mind the world.
Yeah. Now, what I want to say there is deliberation has one direction of fit. Making up your mind has one direction of fit. That is, when you make up your mind, you're doing something. And making up your mind will fail. The action of making up your mind will fail if you don't actually make up your mind. But experiencing yourself making up your mind isn't making up your mind. So experiencing making up your mind has the same direction of fit as perception or belief. So when everyone in cognitive science or consciousness says experiences of deliberation are epiphenomenal, and this is the end of the world, I'm inclined to say, well, of course they are. It's not the end of the world. I mean, they have causal effects on the beliefs we have about ourselves, on everything else, but it's making up your mind that does the work, not experiencing yourself making up your mind. So this is why this phrase conscious agency is extremely confusing. Is it the experience of your agency? That's one thing. Or is it the agency that you experience? That's another. So I'm inclined to bite the bullet, if it is a bullet, and say, yeah, there, in a very straightforward sense, the experience of deliberation is epiphenomenal, at the first order level. And if that gets me into problems, I'll handle them if I have to.
Actually, the early answer is structural component, but I just want to make sure that once again, it's much interesting, I'm very clear. So, the distinction between automatic and evolution or action, I think is a dangerous distinction. And we were talking about hypnosis, for example. I think that a lot of our acts are it's a mix of control and automatic. So I'm thinking, for example, when you engage in writing a text and you engage in automatic writing, and it's intentional, drive, like most painters, you're talking about painting, most painters try to loosen up and use self-consciousness and preconception about how they should do things. So there's a drive, there's an intention to become automatic, right? And I think that a lot of things that we do in trying to achieve the bypass our ability is trying to get into the midst of controlling automatic. So there's something that hybrid and kind of wary of the distinction. So the second thing from the developmental psychologist perspective, looking at infant and young children, thinking about action and intention, raising understanding intention, and detecting intention in another, I think, the context of the past is crucial. I mean, it's difficult for me to talk about these things outside of the context in which we perform an action. There's a real difference between reaching and other word or producing a drawing. So, but it's not a real question, it's two points.
Yeah. No, I agree with them both. And I completely agree that the distinction between, say, controlled and automatic, there are layers and levels and structure. So even something like driving or playing a musical instrument, you're aware and you're controlled. The act of, at a general level, the act is a controlled one. But then there are specific details of the movement which run off in an automatic kind of way. I mean, changing the gear or playing these particular notes. So that playing the entire solo is in some sense a controlled process. You can stop playing, but the development of it at a specific level might be automatic. I completely agree.
I'd like to make this kind of a solemn point. Almost a metaphysical one. I think I completely sympathize with the gist of your points, that experience of agency, as any kind of experience, must have, as you pointed, the kind of direction, the mind to well direction. It's just because it is, and I thought that in fact Cyril's quote was hard to understand really. If there is no kind of afferent process of information processing as a causal source, as a process which ends up in experience, how could any output, I mean metaphysically speaking, be taken to be unexperienced, right? I mean, so in the case of visual perception, auditory perception, I mean, if there is an experience at all, we understand it to be an end result of some kind of afferent information process. Now, it is a process, a very interesting scientific puzzle to understand what causal path gives rise to an experience of agency. And if we think, as I think we do, that one condition of one constraint on an appropriate theory of the experience of agency is that we don't want just to have a conceptual representation, we don't want to just confuse experience of agency with beliefs, right? So it's not just application of the concept of intention or the concept of action or the concept of agency, that is involved in our non-conceptual representation sense of agency. Then there is a process, right?
So, and I think that if I understood Searle's quote, which I reacted to fast, I mean, it seems to me that the very idea that the experience of agency shares the same direction of fit as the intention, as the action, seems to me a metaphysical, puzzle. I just don't understand what it would mean for an experience at all to share the direction of fit. I just think that that's a big metaphysical puzzle. The second thing I'd like to say, and that relates to a point made by Joël, that I would put it in a different way. It seems to me that a lot of empirical work from internal models of action, does converge on the idea that there is a relation between the sense of agency and the experience of agency, and the mechanism, the phenomenon of sensory suppression. So sensory suppression is the mechanism whereby the perceptual consequences of your own actions are somewhat discounted automatically, right? So it's not just that you process, for example, visual information about the consequences of your action in the same way you visually process the consequences of others' actions, that since you could predict them, you in some sense discount them, you don't pay as much attention. And I suggest that for your account, it would be an interesting thing to do, to examine the contribution to the phenomenology of the sense of agency of this discarding of visual information processing. Not just that you process visual information the way you process visual information when changes in your environment that are up for visual information processing are results from others' actions or don't result from anybody's actions, right? When they are the results of your own actions, and since they are predictable, a lot of evidence from the work by Chris Frith and Walker and Hager and so on does suggest that there is this discarding, and that is an input to the sense of agency, it seems to me, right? For example, it's been suggested that schizophrenic patients, in them, the mechanism for sensory suppression is not working properly, and that's so given that they do not discard as much the visually processed information that results from their own actions, they have this propensity for hallucination. Okay, so these are the two things I wanted to say. The metaphysical point, I just don't understand exactly what the view would be that you could think of any experience, including the experience of agency, as having the direction of intention and matter. I just don't understand it.
Let me make brief
Just
comments.
don't understand the point.
So let me say something briefly about both. I share your perplexity about what that would be. But here's, I think, an interesting result. Suppose that it just falls out of the fact that these experiences are experiences, that they have to have a certain direction of fit. The interesting result is, for conceptual states, you can have states with either direction of fit. Beliefs have one direction of fit, desires, tensions have a different direction of fit. Right? You can go either way. But when it comes to phenomenal states, experiences, it's just necessarily the case that it can only go one way. Now, I think that's true. It's kind of puzzling. I don't see why it would be true, although I believe it is true. So that's kind of an interesting, I think, consequence of the thought. The second point, the question here is, I think, whether the attenuation of sensory processing, which is involved in phenomenology of agency, is this part of the causal mechanism, or does it also enter into the content? I completely agree that the Haggard stuff very nicely shows that it's part of the causal mechanism, by means of which the experience of agency is generated. So that I'm completely on board with. The more metaphysical kind of question is, does that also enter the content of these states? Or is it just a part of the story as done? What are the mechanisms by means of which these experiences are produced? But you can characterize the experiences without saying anything about attenuation of expected sensory consequences. I'm inclined to think that it's just a story about causal mechanisms, which doesn't make it not interesting. It just says that's what it's doing.
I mean, one interesting issue is that would be to study the specific phenomenology of the visual experience of the consequences of your own actions, as opposed, suppose that you could do an experiment in which the sensory consequences of your own actions are exactly the same as the sensory consequences of the actions of somebody else.
Yeah.
Then study the phenomenology, the distinct phenomenology of the visual processing of those consequences as they arise from your actions or as they arise from the actions of
But
somebody
that would
else.
just show that there are deep connections between, I mean, there's sort of intersensory connections which hold on us. I mean, if you give someone certain auditory or visual, if you give them certain visual cues, you can change what they hear. If you give people, you know, certain auditory cues, but you can still, you don't need to characterize auditory experience in visual terms.
And I shut up. One experiment by Hagen shows the phenomenon of efferent binding. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the relevant difference is whether you press, so pressing a key is spontaneous.
Yeah, yeah,
You generated it.
yeah.
Or whether you're made to do it by transcranial magnetic stimulation. And then it produces a sound.
Yeah.
And so your phenomenology of the temporal sequence
Yeah.
of the pressing followed by the sound is much more, there's an attraction, a temporal attraction, if you generate the action. And there's a repulsion, temporal repulsion, if you're not, right? So, I mean, so I'm going to say that, I mean, clearly that is something probably that you have a phenomenological awareness of this temporal sequence.
Yeah, you do.
And so would you say that that contributes directly to your experience of agency? Or you're saying it just part of the causal path?
I think of those as sort of the same claims. I mean, there are the perceptual system understood widely is set up such that when you get this temporal binding in vision and temporal binding between what intentions and that, then that will cause you to have an experience of agency. But that's like saying, when I have a certain visual perception of someone saying "da," I hear "da" even though they've actually said "ga," like the McGurk effect or something like that. So you can change what people hear by changing what you show them on the face of someone they're looking at. So, yeah, I mean, phenomenal content in one modality will cause phenomenal content in another modality, but you can still characterize the phenomenal contents independently of each other. That's the thought.
It's about the third problem you raised again, the proposal. The idea that the experience of intentional situation is not sufficient for the experience of agency. My first problem with that is I don't have a sense that in the case of the kind of case says an experience of intentional possession at all. I think this is a project as well as moving.
You say more about one? What's missing? Or do I have to say more about why?
You can say, unless you have a very Wagnerian notion of what it is to have an experience of intentional possession, which is an experience of a mental state and an experience of some state of the world, which fits in terms of symmetrical substance. Unless this is the notion of an experience of intentional possession, and I think that says perhaps not enough. It's perhaps an experience of possession. I'm not sure it's an experience of intentional possession.
Okay, so your ground is an
I mean,
experience.
you keep read that there's an experience of my mental state causing something,
Okay.
and it happens to be the case.
Yeah.
And I think in the case of Davidson's Planberg, it's a bit of a coincidence that the nervousness produced an event with a content that matched the desire and belief.
It's unexpected, is that why it's a great thing?
It's, I mean, nervousness, I mean, you could have been nervous for some other reason. I mean, if
No, because it's a reaction. It's
Well,
no, I mean, the nervousness produced something. It's a coincidence that what it produced happened to fit the content of the belief of the
I think I can construct a case. So, so you're suddenly aware of an intention. The thought suddenly occurs to you that you had the intention to let go of the rope. And then you realize, oh my God, what kind of person am I? To let my client partner, fall to her death.
Oh my God.
Oh my God, that's right. That's right. And then you start realizing your moral depravity. And you start sweating, and you are aware, at the very least, that there's a counterfactual dependence. Had you not been aware of this intention, which you didn't feel yourself acting on, then you wouldn't have let your planning partner fall.
Yeah, but isn't it, I mean,
Let me ask you this, is the problem with the causal part? So I said that you're aware of counterfactual dependence. Is the problem with maybe that's not enough to be aware of the cause. Is the problem with the causal part or the intention part? Or both?
no, I think my problem is with, and perhaps this is why when so introduced the self-referential element in that.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's not enough that a state with a certain intent
Yeah.
poses
Yes.
some kind of something that's thematically matched with.
Yeah.
It must be that it is in virtue of having this content that its state poses participant in the world.
Okay.
And this supposes some form of, and is in virtue then of being analyzed in terms of something certain counterfactual dependencies. And in this case, you can have many other states other than the states with that very content, which could have produced sweating and so forth.
Okay, so I just gave you a case where the content does the work, but it's mediated. I mean, I have the intention, I'm aware of the intention to let go of my partner. That doesn't directly cause the sweating. Maybe the awareness of my moral depravity causes the sweating. But I think you can come up with cases where you have the intention, but you're aware of having the intention, and it's in virtue of the intention having the particular content it does, that the causal chain proceeds by the content of that intention.
Rushing.
Right, so you're aware, what is that called? You don't experience your blushing as an action, but you might experience it that core, yeah. I mean, is the thought going to be an intention? That's suppose you have an intention to blush, and the intention to blush itself is one which is an embarrassing one. People who have intentions to blush should be embarrassed about having intentions to blush, because it's a kind of yeah. I mean, all this is very weird, but I think you can construct weird Davidson type cases where.
Anyway, this is not my main
Okay,
point.
sorry.
Okay, so now, assuming grant that, and then the rest question whether
we can have the same distinction in case not of the prior intention, but the
Yes.
intention in action. And Jerome said yes, because you can have that the same action. And yet, it seems to me we must distinguish at least two components in the experience of agency. One which is a sense of having initiated the action, then the sense of controlling the action while it's mental, it's informing, where you have this two-form relation of fates and pluralism. And you can have, and it's true that you can have one without the other, but I think in the case of fate action, you have at least one vertical experience, which is the experience of having initiated it. So I'm not sure you can have a complete dissociation here between having an experience of intentional possession, your intentional action triggering, and then having an experience of agency.
So you would modify the basic proposal, the basic structure of the experience of being an agent to the sense of initiation? Or
I mean, for a full-blown experience of agency, you probably have to have
and
both initiation and control.
control?
But there's some sense, I mean, even towards our friend actions, it's not just things that happen to us.
Yeah.
When we fake
Things that were started.
we still are responsible in some way for our actions. Otherwise, we do not feel any responsibilities for actions we do that
Yeah.
don't really feel the
Yeah. But, I mean, then we come back to Jerome's point, which is that if you can get a counterexample with intentions, prior intentions, why shouldn't we be able to get a counterexample with intentions and action? Because the only sense I can make of intentions and action is the content is more fine than but the direction of foot is the same. So it seems like it would be puzzling as to why the experience of being caused by your intentions and action should be central to the experience of initiation if the experience of being caused by prior intentions isn't. What's the difference between those two? But maybe we can talk about this later.
We have two more questions, not really enough time. François and Stephen. If it's short, I mean.
No, that's okay. I skip.
As a copy.
Yeah, well, mine is probably short. What if somebody were to argue that this is conceptually confused? That the conceptual space of agency, intention, voluntary, involuntary, willing, etc., is the moral space. You didn't talk in these categories when you were talking about your theory or analysis here. You didn't bring in moral categories at all. Though it's interesting when you discussed in passing the climber case. You said, well, what kind of person am I? That is, you did use moral categories there. To put my point a little more exactly, is that all of the concepts here and the talk that we are involved in has nothing whatsoever to do with science. Nothing. Now, you might think that you can take some of these notions and give an explication in a Carnackian sense of these notions, but you're not talking in the ordinary ways we have of talking about action and agency. So if you want to do that, you have to engage in another project. Now, you were interested in the phenomenology of these sorts of things. Now, the way we experience things is going to have to do with the concepts that we apply. And if we're thinking about these in these kinds of concepts, which involve moral notions, then we're going to characterize the phenomenology in a certain way. But again, that's not going to have anything to do with cognitive science, if it's a science, if you will. So a whole talk about causation here, which goes back to David's reasons and causes and all that, has led us down this path, which somebody might argue is an error to begin with. So the project is confused. What if somebody would say that? That's a small question.
Well, I'll be quick because it's lunchtime. I agree with some of it and I disagree with other bits. The bit I agree with is that these notions are connected to moral thought and moral theory. That there are connections. But what I disagree with is that you can't I don't think you have to do moral theory to have to say something about the content of these experiences. And let me just say one example of one. Take someone with an anarchic hand. So with this hand, they're fine. They can pick up cups, they can control it. They have a normal phenomenology of agency. This hand does things which they feel not responsible for. Now there's moral talk there. They feel responsible for what this hand does. They feel not responsible for this hand. So we're on the borders of moral discourse, granted. But the basic phenomenological fact that this person reports is, this one's okay. I'm in charge of this one. I ain't in charge of this one. And we can do science as to, well, in two respects. One is, why on earth, what's going wrong in terms of the neural processing, in terms of the sensory processing, whatever, as to why they don't feel in charge of this thing anymore. And you can ask that question without being a moral theorist. And you can also ask, is their experience of not being in control veridical or not? What is it to be in control? And is their experience of not being the author of this hand's behavior, is that veridical or not? So I agree there's a moral upshot from this debate. I don't think these questions are so morally loaded that my whole talk was confused.
It's the moral responsibility, the moral theory.